On the 3rd of July, 1969, 17 days before Americans walked on the moon, a rocket taller than a 30-story building rose a few feet off a launch pad in the Kazakhstan desert, hung there for a moment, and then fell back down and detonated. The blast was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded, powerful enough to shatter windows 25 miles away and hurl chunks of the launch tower more than half a mile. This was the N-1, the Soviet Union's giant moon rocket. And this was its second attempt to fly. It would make two more. All four ended in destruction. The N-1 flew 4 times and exploded 4 times and never once reached space. And the reason it kept failing is not a story of Russian incompetence, as it is often told, but a story about a single design decision so bold and so flawed that it doomed the machine before it ever left the drawing board. To understand why the N-1 kept tearing itself apart, you have to start at the bottom of the rocket, where its fatal choice lived. Every large rocket is defined by its engines, and here the Soviets did something no one had ever done before or has ever done since on a machine this size. The first stage of the N-1 was powered by 30 separate engines arranged in 2 rings around the base, all of them required to fire together in perfect harmony. For comparison, the American Saturn V that beat it to the moon used just 5 engines in its first stage. The N-1 had 30. And that single number 30 is the thread you can pull to unravel every disaster that followed. The reason for all those engines was itself a story of a road not taken. The Soviet Union had a brilliant engine designer, but he and the rocket's chief designer had fallen into a bitter feud and refused to work together. So the moon rocket was cut off from the country's best large engines. The designer it turned to instead could only build small ones, superb little engines, but small. And if your engines are small, the only way to lift something as heavy as a moon rocket is to use a great many of them. 30 small engines were chosen not because 30 was a good idea, but because 30 was the only path left after the feud closed every better one. The rocket was built around a compromise, and the compromise was its doom. The engines themselves, it must be said, were small marvels, and this is one of the cruelest ironies of the whole story. Each little engine was elegant, efficient, and powerful for its size, using a clever design that squeezed more performance out of its propellant than almost anything the Americans had. Decades later, after the Soviet Union fell, dozens of these engines were found still crated in a warehouse, hidden away by engineers who could not bear to destroy their finest work. And American rocket companies bought them and flew them on their own rockets into the 2000s. Astonished at how good they were. The tragedy of the N-1 was never the engines. It was that 30 of even the best small engines packed together and asked to act as one created a machine more dangerous than the sum of its excellent parts. 30 engines firing at once creates a nightmare that grows worse the more you think about it. Each engine is a place where something can go wrong, a place where a pump can seize or a fuel line can crack or a fire can start. With 5 engines, you have 5 chances for a catastrophic failure at liftoff. With 30, you have 6 times as many, and worse, the engines are packed so tightly together in their rings that a failure in one can easily damage its neighbors. A single engine exploding does not just remove one engine, it can spray shrapnel and fire across the others, turning one small failure into a chain reaction that consumes the whole base of the rocket in seconds. 30 engines did not add up. They multiplied. If you have ever tried to keep a whole team of people perfectly in step, you understand a piece of what the N-1 was attempting and why it was so hard. It is not enough for 30 engines to work. They have to be balanced. If one engine on one side pushes a little harder than its opposite, the rocket starts to tip, and something has to notice and correct it instantly. If one engine fails, its opposite number must be shut down too to keep the thrust even, or the rocket will roll and pivot out of control. Coordinating 30 roaring engines, sensing the health of each one, and making split-second decisions to balance them was a control problem far beyond anything attempted before. And it fell to a machine that was being asked to do the impossible. The usual story is that the N-1 failed because Soviet rocketry was simply crude, a backward program throwing cheap hardware at a problem it did not understand. That story does not survive a close look at what actually broke. The engineers were not crude. They built a special computer, one of the most ambitious control systems of its era, whose only job was to monitor all 30 engines and shut down any that misbehaved, automatically shutting off the opposite engine too to keep the rocket balanced. It was a genuinely advanced idea, decades ahead in concept. The problem was that the electronics of the 1960s were not good enough to do the job reliably, and the system, brilliant on paper, kept making catastrophic decisions in the fractions of a second it had to act. The failure was not a lack of ambition. It was ambition running years ahead of what the technology could actually deliver. The sheer scale of the machine made every one of these problems harder. The N1 stood over 300 feet tall and fully fueled, weighed around 6 million pounds, most of it propellant. It was, and remains, the most powerful rocket ever to leave a launch pad. Its 30 engines together producing more thrust at liftoff than even the mighty Saturn V. It had to be that powerful because the Soviet approach to reaching the moon needed to throw a great deal of weight, and its engines being small had to make up in numbers what they lacked in individual size. But every extra ton of rocket meant more that could go wrong, more plumbing, more structure, more fuel waiting to detonate if anything failed. The N1 was a giant built out of a compromise, and its size only enlarged the compromise along with everything else. The deepest flaw of all was not in any single part, but in how the rocket was tested, or rather, how it was not. The Americans, building the Saturn V, took every engine in every stage and fired it over and over on the ground for years until they trusted it completely, and they built enormous test stands to do it. The Soviets, short on money and time, could not afford to build a test stand big enough to fire the entire 30-engine first stage together on the ground before flying it. So they never did, not once. The very first time all 30 engines of an N1 ever fired together as a complete unit was during an actual launch, with the whole rocket riding on top. Every flight was, in effect, the first full-scale test of the most complex and dangerous part of the machine conducted live with everything to lose. They were debugging the rocket by launching it, and each launch cost them a rocket. There was a deeper reason the untested engines were so dangerous, and it lay in how they were built. To keep them light and simple, these engines were sealed up at the factory and could not be fired, checked, and then flown. Test firing an engine used up parts and seals that were not designed to be reused. So an engine that had been proven to work could not itself be the engine that flew. Instead, the builders would test a few engines from a batch, and if those passed, they would trust that the others from the same batch, the ones actually bolted to the rocket, were just as good. It was testing by sampling, hoping the flown engines matched their tested cousins, and on a rocket with 30 of them, the odds that every single unflown engine was flawless grew painfully thin. They were flying engines that had never themselves been lit. The first flight in February 1969 showed exactly what that meant. The rocket lifted off, and for about a minute it seemed to be climbing well. Then a fire broke out in the engine section. A fuel line had failed and sprayed the compartment, and the flames confused the control computer, which read the chaos as a general engine failure and shut down all 30 engines at once, dooming the rocket. It fell and was destroyed. The machine had not been beaten by bad engines so much as by the impossible task of watching 30 of them at once and knowing, in an instant, which readings to trust when everything started going wrong. That first failure also exposed how little margin the design left for the control system to think. When something started going wrong, the computer had only a heartbeat to decide which of 30 engines was the problem and what to do about it, and the sensors feeding it were themselves being cooked by fire and shaken by vibration. A human could not possibly react fast enough, and the machine of the 1960s, for all its cleverness, could be fooled by bad readings into doing exactly the wrong thing, like a doctor amputating the wrong limb in a panic, shutting down all 30 engines to save the rocket, when in truth only one had failed, guaranteed the very crash it was trying to prevent. The safeguard became the executioner, not through stupidity, but because the problem it faced was simply too fast and too complex for the tools of its time. The second flight, that catastrophic July night just before Apollo 11, was worse and even more revealing. Moments after liftoff, a piece of debris or perhaps a loose bolt sucked into a pump caused one engine to explode almost immediately. The blast damaged neighboring engines and severed control lines, and the computer, trying to save the rocket, shut down nearly every engine. With almost no thrust, the fully fueled giant rose just above the tower, tilted, and fell straight back down onto the pad, where its millions of pounds of propellant detonated in the enormous fireball that flattened the launch complex. It was the single most destructive rocket failure in history. And it happened because one small failure among 30 engines had cascaded in seconds into total catastrophe. Exactly the chain reaction the 30-engine design made almost inevitable. The explosion was so complete that debris rained down across the whole site, and one of the rocket's spherical tanks was hurled miles away and landed nearly intact. It took the program the better part of 2 years just to rebuild the launch complex the blast had destroyed before another rocket could even be tried. The engineers did not give up, and their persistence deserves respect even though it failed. They rebuilt the launch complex, redesigned the plumbing, improved the control system, and tried again in June 1971. This third rocket got off the pad, but an unexpected violent rolling motion set in, a twisting of the whole vehicle that the control system could not counter, and it spun out of control and was lost within a minute. The fourth and final flight in November 1972 came the closest of all. It flew for more than a minute and a half, almost to the point where the first stage would have finished its job. Then a shock ran through the engines as some were shut down in the normal sequence. A violent surge in the plumbing tore an engine apart, and the rocket exploded once more. It was the last N1 ever to fly. A pattern runs through all four failures, and it is worth naming because it is the signature of the design. In every case, the rocket itself did not simply blow up on its own. Something went wrong with one engine or one fuel line, a small and survivable fault in isolation, and then the trouble spread. On the first flight, a fire confused the computer into shutting everything down. On the second, one exploding engine wrecked its neighbors and severed the controls. On the third, a rolling motion the system could not tame. On the fourth, a violent surge as engines shut down tore one apart. 4 different first faults and 4 times the same ending, because a machine of 30 interlinked engines had no way to contain a small failure before it became a total one. The rocket did not have 30 ways to fail. It had 30 ways for one failure to become fatal. By then, the race was already lost, and everyone knew it. The Americans had landed on the moon 6 times over. The whole reason for the N1, to carry a Soviet cosmonaut to the lunar surface first, had evaporated 3 years earlier when Apollo 11 touched down. 2 more N1 rockets stood nearly complete in their assembly building, ready to fly, when the program was quietly canceled in 1974, and the order came down to destroy everything. The man who ordered the cancellation was the very engine designer whose feud had denied the rocket its best engines in the first place, now finally in charge of the whole enterprise. One of his first acts was to kill the machine he had helped cripple, and to erase it so completely that the crated hardware was hidden, the drawings buried, and the launch pads left to the desert. The rocket that had never been allowed to succeed was not even allowed to be remembered. There's a haunting question that hangs over the whole program, and it is whether the N1 was actually close to working. The fourth flight had reached almost the end of its first stage burn, and the engineers had by then developed a much improved set of engines, ones that could finally be tested and reused, ready for the fifth rocket that was never allowed to fly. Some of the people who worked on it believed to the end of their lives that 1 or 2 more attempts would have finally cracked it, that the machine was on the verge of success when the plug was pulled. Others thought the 30 engine design was fundamentally cursed and would never have been reliable enough to trust with a human crew. The argument can never be settled because the moment the moon race was lost, there was no reason to spend another ruble finding out. And the rockets that might have answered the question were broken up for scrap. The engineers who built the N1 were not fools, and this is the part the mocking version of the story always misses. They were given an impossible hand, a rocket cut off from the nation's best engines by a personal feud, forced to solve the resulting problem with 30 small engines, denied the money to test the thing properly on the ground, and rushed against a deadline they could not meet. Within those constraints, they built genuinely advanced machines and a control system ahead of its time, and they came within 90 seconds of a successful first stage flight on their final attempt. The N1 did not fail because its builders lacked genius. It failed because no amount of genius could overcome a foundational choice that multiplied every risk by 30 and then forbade them from ever testing the result before betting a rocket on it. The law of the N1 reaches far beyond rocketry, and it is worth carrying away. Complexity is not free, and it does not add up, it multiplies. Every part you add to a system is not just one more thing that can break, but one more thing that can break everything else around it. And a design that depends on 30 things working in perfect concert is not 6 times as risky as one depending on 5. It is far worse than that because the parts can turn on each other. The N1 was an attempt to reach the moon by brute multiplication, and multiplication, it turned out, was exactly the enemy. If you had stood in that desert on the 3rd of July, 1969, and watched a rocket, the height of a skyscraper, rise a few feet and then fall back into the largest man-made fireball short of a nuclear bomb, you would have been watching the price of a single decision made years earlier in a design office by men with no good options left. 30 engines. It was the only way forward, and it was the reason there was no way forward at all. The N1 never reached space, but it remains the most powerful rocket ever to leave a launch pad, if only for a few doomed seconds at a time, and the largest machine humanity ever built and then chose completely to forget. Its lesson outlived it, though, carried in those crated engines that flew on other rockets. And in every designer since, who has looked at a machine and asked not how powerful it could be, but how many separate things it was quietly asking to go right all at once, for it to work at all.